Gas shipments were still en route when China pulled the plug. No tariff, no speech, just a quiet freeze, and $2.5 billion evaporated in 3 days. Exporters were caught mid-contract, terminals stalled, European buyers stepped in, and Beijing. They already had the replacements lined up. Russia, Qatar, Iran. This wasn't retaliation, it was preparation. On April 18, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce issued an internal directive halting all purchases of U.S. liquefied natural gas, effective immediately. Within 72 hours, over a dozen scheduled LNG shipments from Texas and Louisiana were either canceled or redirected, costing U.S. exporters an estimated $2.47 billion in forfeited contracts, according to S&P Global Commodity Insights. The freeze, announced without a formal press release, followed Washington's decision to impose a 245% tariff on Chinese solar and EV components. While White House officials described China's LNG halt as short-term volatility, Chinese state media outlet Global Times called it a recalibration of dependency and exposure to hostile supply lines. The abruptness wasn't just commercial, it was geopolitical. Sinopec's $600 million spot market LNG deal for Q2 was terminated within 24 hours, triggering a 7.3% dip in U.S. LNG futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. That kind of collapse doesn't wait for diplomacy, but the real alarm isn't how fast the $2.5 billion disappeared. It's who China replaced that gas with and how coordinated that shift appears to be. Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska shipped nearly 90% of U.S. LNG to Asia in 2024, and they're now the frontline casualties of Beijing's exit. According to the Energy Information Administration, EIA, the U.S. exported 8.1 million metric tons of LNG to China last year, 6.4% of China's total imports. On paper, that sounds marginal. In practice, it's concentrated revenue, with Texas alone accounting for $1.1 billion of that trade. Cheniere Energy's Sabine Pass terminal, the largest U.S. LNG facility, was forced to idle 2 of its 6 trains following China's exit, reducing its May 2025 shipment forecast by 16%. Port of Corpus Christi CEO Sean Strawbridge told Bloomberg, "This is the single most disruptive event to Gulf energy logistics since COVID, and that disruption is spreading." Kinder Morgan has paused a $400 million expansion of its Gulf Coast LNG pipeline, citing regulatory and market instability since the freeze. Meanwhile, Louisiana's Lake Charles project, still awaiting final investment decision, is now facing a 12 to 18-month delay, according to a recent investor note from Wood Mackenzie. But a few idle terminals are just the surface. The deeper crisis? Supply without buyers and debt without cash flow. During the 2018 to 2019 trade war, Moody's Analytics estimated the U.S. lost 300,000 jobs, with energy and agriculture absorbing over 40% of the hit. A similar pattern is emerging now. Just 1 week after the LNG cutoff, Freeport LNG filed a WARN notice with the Texas Workforce Commission, announcing layoffs affecting 126 workers due to market disruptions tied to foreign policy decisions. Industry groups aren't waiting for it to snowball. American Petroleum Institute CEO Mike Summers told Reuters, "Energy trade retaliation has real-world consequences for blue-collar workers across America's Gulf Coast. That threat extends beyond jobs." In Cameron Parish, Louisiana, a region where LNG royalties account for 38% of the local budget, officials are already forecasting a $24 million shortfall for fiscal 2026. And in Galveston County, Texas, housing starts tied to LNG worker expansion have flatlined for the first time in 4 years, according to Redfin data. So while D.C. debates tariffs, gas towns are bracing for another round of layoffs and foreclosures. But the damage isn't just domestic. Chinese capital was also deeply embedded in the infrastructure itself. Sinopec and CNOOC weren't just buyers, they were stakeholders. Beijing's financial presence in North American LNG stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Baja Peninsula. In 2023, China's CNOOC committed $3.1 billion to Mexico's Costa Azul terminal through a multi-phase equity and offtake deal. That project is now in limbo. According to an April 2025 update from Ienova, the project's primary developer, Chinese capital withdrawals have jeopardized first phase deployment, prompting a pause in construction. In the U.S., Tellurian's Driftwood LNG in Louisiana has seen similar turmoil. Its $12 billion financing plan, once anchored by Sinopec, is now under renegotiation with Middle Eastern banks, per a recent Wall Street Journal report. Without Chinese offtake guarantees, U.S. developers are facing steep refinancing costs. Barclays now estimates a 21% average cost of capital increase for LNG projects tied to Asia. This isn't just about Chinese exit, it's about who they're replacing U.S. partnerships with, and how quickly those new ties are forming. Days after the U.S. LNG halt, China locked in a new 27-year supply deal with Qatar Energy, its fourth in less than 24 months. The agreement, valued at roughly $3.2 billion annually, secures 4 million tons of LNG per year, replacing nearly 80% of what it was previously buying from the U.S. According to Bloomberg NEF, China has now signed over 19 million tons per annum in new long-term contracts with Qatar since 2022. Positioning Doha as Beijing's top LNG supplier by 2026. Russia is filling the rest. Despite Western sanctions, China imported 2.5 million tons of LNG from Russia's Yamal and Sakhalin projects in Q1 2025, up 31% year-over-year, using yuan-denominated contracts to skirt SWIFT restrictions, per shipping data from Refinitiv. Even Iran has entered the picture. In March, CNPC revived an older framework to process Iranian gas swaps through Turkmenistan, adding redundancy to China's overland pipeline network. Analysts at Energy Intelligence now say that China has systematically diversified away from U.S. LNG exposure over a 36-month arc, and the recent shutdown wasn't reactionary, but premeditated. And yet, while the pivot looks complete on paper, there's a deeper strategic layer forming, one that may not be about energy at all. Since China halted its LNG imports from the U.S., Europe has moved fast to lock in the displaced supply under more favorable terms. According to Eurostat, the EU imported 23.6 billion cubic meters of U.S. LNG in Q1 2025 alone, a 31% jump from the previous quarter. Germany and France renegotiated several spot contracts as U.S. exporters scrambled to redirect canceled Asian shipments. Bloomberg reports that France's ENGIE secured new shipments at a 68-cent per MMB2 discount compared to last year's contract prices. This arbitrage opportunity emerged because U.S. producers prioritized volume continuity over margin. In effect, Europe gained both energy security and leverage, accessing American gas originally meant for Asia at fire sale rates. Meanwhile, China's absence has reduced demand pressure, helping Europe build its LNG reserves to 88% of capacity by mid-April, unusually high for this time of year, according to Gas Infrastructure Europe. But while Europe reaps discounted energy, American exporters are realizing that global buyers are no longer locked into fixed loyalties, just flexible options. In 2024, the U.S. accounted for just 5.5% of China's LNG imports, equivalent to 8.1 million metric tons per the EIA. That figure, while financially significant for American firms, was strategically negligible for Beijing. China's top suppliers, Australia, Qatar, and Russia, collectively covered more than 70% of its LNG demand. So when Washington used LNG as a bargaining chip, the threat lacked teeth. As energy economist Mikael Maiden at Oxford Institute noted, the U.S. overestimated the geopolitical value of its LNG exports to China. Beijing treated them as short-term hedges, not dependencies. Moreover, China's domestic production of gas rose 6.7% year-over-year in Q1 2025, softening the need for long-haul imports. Add in Beijing's recent deals for pipeline gas from Russia and swap flows from Central Asia, and U.S. gas became redundant. The supposed leverage wasn't a weapon, it was a misread. And in trying to use it, Washington may have accelerated the very disengagement it hoped to avoid. But the US hasn't backed down. It's escalating, and this next move could determine whether this is a spat or a fracture. Effective April 22nd, President Trump imposed a $1.5 million per docking fee on Chinese-owned LNG carriers entering U.S. ports, branding it a national security surcharge. The administration claims the fee offsets surveillance risks posed by Chinese vessels and recoups lost revenue from suspended contracts. However, analysts say it's tantamount to a retaliatory tariff, without calling it one. The American Association of Port Authorities warned the surcharge could disrupt up to $1.2 billion in ancillary trade per month, affecting shipping insurers, tug operators, and port logistics firms. Meanwhile, the China Association of Shipowners told Caixin that its members are considering bypassing U.S. LNG entirely, redirecting to Australia and the UAE. Bloomberg Intelligence estimates that 37% of U.S.-China LNG trade previously used Chinese-owned tankers, meaning this surcharge directly affects nearly 4 out of every 10 shipments. Far from defusing tensions, the fee could prompt Beijing to retaliate against U.S.-flagged vessels in the South China Sea or restrict American firms' access to Chinese maritime insurers. And if that happens, the escalation will bleed beyond energy into finance, freight, and strategic shipping lanes. Energy was once the shock absorber in U.S.-China tensions, a sector where pragmatism outlived politics. That buffer is now gone. For the first time in 2 decades, China's total LNG purchase orders from U.S. exporters have fallen to 0, according to Platts Analytics. Simultaneously, Chinese foreign direct investment in U.S. energy infrastructure has declined 84% since 2021, per Rhodium Group. The Wall Street Journal reported in April that Beijing is instructing state-owned firms to reduce exposure to U.S. dollar-denominated contracts across all resource sectors. This isn't symbolic, it's structural. As Columbia University economist Shangjin Wei puts it, what we're witnessing is not a tactical retreat, but a strategic realignment. Even semiconductors, soybeans, and rare earths had moments of insulation. LNG no longer does. And with China building new energy corridors through Central Asia and deepening yuan-based commodity settlements, the economic links that once tethered the two powers are now dissolving. One gas shipment, one contract, one vessel at a time. And if energy, the most tangible, mutual interest, just became a fault line, what happens when the focus shifts to money itself? So let me ask you this. If China can walk away from U.S. gas, rewire its suppliers, and pivot investment strategies in under 90 days, what's stopping them from walking away from U.S. debt next? Because Beijing still holds over $775 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. And in the corridors of power, from the People's Bank of China to Zhongnanhai, conversations are already shifting from imports to assets. If that shift goes from theory to policy, the consequences won't be measured in lost contracts, but in collapsing currencies. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think holds the real leverage now? And what happens if the next shock hits Wall Street, not the Gulf Coast? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.